All right, what's up, everybody? We are on video installment number 13 of the Eleventy update videos. This week we rebooted the Eleventy leaderboards. Kind of back up, we're running again. We had 2 runs between this video and the last video that was posted. And the winner of the leaderboard number 18 was in fact lamplight.dev. Congratulations to Chris. And then run number 19 was the accessibility project. So congratulations to those folks. We did actually add a new column to the leaderboards that showcases the sites that report a meta name generator tag in their source code, so that we know that the site is in fact still built with Eleventy. One other thing that came out of the leaderboards this week was we added new side quests, which shows the sites with the least amount of JavaScript, which have this little tag here. There are also awards for smallest page weight. We have a little tag for new sites that didn't show up before. Fastest TTFB, which is time to first byte. Lowest LCP, which is largest contentful paint. And I think one other one that isn't coming to mind right now. But yeah, look for more of those to show up. Basically, when it comes to this lowest JavaScript one, these are all the sites that have no JavaScript. So I think it was like a 171-way tie on the leaderboards right now for that. So yeah, even if your site isn't listed as one of the top sites in the leaderboards, having 4 hundos, you still might have a side quest award. So check out your listing there. And just starting out the community roundup, David Darns posted an update to their Eleventy plugin Ghost package. So if you're using Ghost with Eleventy, check that out. David also posted an example gist showing how to use the Parcel CSS compiler with the new Add Extension API. So if you're interested in that, check it out. Fabian posted a few things this week that I thought were good to share. The first one was this custom themed mermaid diagrams. Now, mermaid diagrams are basically these flowchart diagrams and how to embed those in your Eleventy pages. I think this blog post had also a cool tip showing how to extend the existing Markdown highlighter in Eleventy with your own custom language, so check that out. Fabian also had a good post this week about light dark mode toggle with JS and CSS. And then how to show plausible view counts in Eleventy blog. So how to show usage or page view count statistics on your page if you're using plausible. The Eleventy meetup posted their videos from the last meetup. Nick Taylor had a great one about how they use dev.to as their headless CMS provider and how they syndicate using that service. And Ben Myers also did a really great video about how to use Eleventy Edge, the new Eleventy Edge plugin, to build a Wordle clone. I thought it was really great. Philip Boardman had a migration blog post, how they migrated to Eleventy. And then Ollie Warner also had an excellent migration blog post. I thought there was some really great feedback at the bottom about things that could be improved in Eleventy that I really appreciated. Another really good migration blog post that I really appreciated was this one from Chromatic. They're an agency. They switched their website over to use Eleventy from Drupal. So yeah, check that out. Sanif posted a new version 3 of their Eleventy plugin image to picture. Tahib posted this really great tip on Twitter, just basically reminding folks that they can use the Eleventy ignore file to list a drafts folder. You don't necessarily have to opt those out of your Git repository. You can still check those in. Just list them in your Eleventy ignore if you want those to be ignored by the Eleventy build. Syntactile has this great blog post about a CodePen shortcode. So if you're interested in embedding CodePen on your Eleventy blog, check that out. Cloud Cannon put up a new series on getting started with Eleventy. Cloud Cannon is a CMS provider. Sarah Sweden is working on their practical accessibility course website. And I believe the course is built with Eleventy, and the site is built with Eleventy as well. So check that out. I think the course is almost finished. So if you're interested in practical accessibility, I would get on the pre-orders for that if those are available. And the very least, subscribe to get updates. Alexander had a great post about generating unique IDs for accessibility purposes using a package called NanoID, which I thought was really great. Someone else riffed off of that, how to use that with Eleventy's new add nunjux global API call. So you can actually add a global function to be called inside of your nunjux code like that. Brian Robinson started a new series they're calling 11-second Eleventy, which is basically some mini tutorials on Eleventy concepts. The first one just came out today on Eleventy collections, so check that one out. And then just real quickly, the new sites that I saw come in on Twitter that were built with Eleventy. As I mentioned earlier, Chromatic had that great blog post about their migration process. Their website is now built with Eleventy. It looks great. Another one is this site from Sophie. I really enjoyed the different themes at the top. Really fun, really cool. I especially like this throwback one. Look at that cursor trail. Love it. Holomatrix has a good site built with Eleventy. Backpage Generator built with Eleventy. Another one is this podcast site called AWS Bytes built with Eleventy. Ted Young's site, Trivia Farm, and CWB Writing. All new sites that came out that were built with Eleventy. All right, so the last video update was kind of about almost exclusively dedicated to this new Island web component that we're publishing under the Eleventy umbrella to do partial hydration. And we shipped it, so you can now try it out. There's some demos here. If you go to our GitHub organization, it's just is-land, and then there's some demos on our subdomain here. The demos are very plain, bare bones, but they do have some Framework SSR examples embedded. It's not just a web components thing. So I would definitely recommend checking out the previous weekly update number 12 for just kind of like a run through of all the different features that come with this Island web component. And we have that linked up from the documentation here as well. But yeah, so now you can try it out, see what it's like, see what it does, see how it works on your site. I do have it in production in a bunch of different places, but it is available for demos, for implementation on your own code. And if you scroll down in the documentation, I do have a list of all the different frameworks that I've included examples for and how those frameworks compare. So if you're kind of in the market for a component JavaScript framework, you can read on how big the libraries are, what their progressive enhancement strategies are, how friendly they are to progressive enhancement, and the different auto init features that come with the Island web component. So I did kind of want to just walk through the demos real quick again to show you some of the new, at least component framework examples that I've added here, and just kind of go through how they compare and how you might go about choosing a component framework if you're in the market to select one of those. So web components is the lightest one. You do want to include the Island web component first and register it first. You kind of get a bunch of behavior for free for web components specifically. Let's see, I kind of went through all this stuff. I did add some more fallback content examples here at the bottom. Click to hydrate, we already showed that one. There's a new ready attribute that gets added when the island is hydrated that you can use for styling if you'd like. So as an example, I tie to the attribute selector in CSS to make this text bold and then hide the clock, this clock emoji. I also added an example that showed how to use it with aspect ratio, the new aspect ratio CSS property, which works great, for example, on video players. So on my personal website, I think I showed an example of using the light YouTube component, web component, but you can really use it to sort of have a fallback experience. So this is just an image here, and then when it gets hydrated, then the light YouTube web component takes over, and the island web component does that swapping for you automatically. So if you're using this light YouTube as embedded in an island, we would automatically toggle that component on when the island's hydrated. All right, so let's walk through some component framework examples and how those work with islands. So on this example, we just have Vue components, and we do actually have two different flavors of Vue in play here. We have Petite Vue, which I think is about 8 kilobyte library. It's a subset of the full Vue API. And then we have the full Vue library. Those are both loaded separately and independently, and initialized separately and independently. They're separate islands. But the full Vue library, I think, is hovering around 50 kilobyte at the moment. And let's look at what the HTML looks like for that. So we have our island here. We have it initializing on visible. We feed the auto init, which tells the island component that we want to initialize the content using Petite Vue. And then we load the library from unpackage just for this demo. You could locally host it, and I would recommend that. But the other thing that we have in play here is this template, and we've kind of gone over this before. It lets you control the fallback content that's visible without JavaScript. You can see that when I disable JavaScript here, the buttons are hidden. And that's important because we don't want buttons that do nothing to be visible to the user. So we toggle those using the islands template swap feature, and it makes this template content only visible or only available when the island is initialized. And the same thing happens with the full Vue example as well. We hide the buttons using this template feature, and then we use an inline script using module island to initialize the Vue component specifically. When it comes to the server rendered Vue representations here at the bottom, or SSR Vue components, it makes it a little bit more complicated because with server-side rendering you do need some server-side integration so that you can initialize your components and render those components on the server, and then you load some additional JavaScript to add event handlers and additional rendering to that component as well. Now, some frameworks are better than others when it comes to their hydration code optimization, and I'm sure there will be more information to come out about how those frameworks compare. I don't really want to weigh in on that in this video specifically. We'll keep it less spicy for now. But yeah, so when it comes to server-side rendering Vue components, you can kind of see that if you don't have any hydration associated with the component, it's just HTML only. You don't need an island at all, because the only thing you're getting from the island is control over when the library JavaScript initializes and runs, and when the component JavaScript initializes and runs. So you can kind of see that if it's just an HTML only component that renders on the server, you don't need an island here. It looks the same with JavaScript or without JavaScript enabled. Now when it comes to hydration here, initializing and rendering the component on the server, you can kind of see that we do get the same non-JavaScript and JavaScript visualization. Now that's great for content layout shift, but it also creates a bad progressive enhancement crossover point. So you can kind of see when the JavaScript is disabled, the buttons do nothing for this specific component. Now I could make an edge handler that increments and re-renders that specific part of the function, and we'll probably add some more Eleventy APIs to work with forms and offer a better progressive enhancement strategy, or easier to implement progressive enhancement strategy when you're using edge functions. But I do think it's very important to understand the difference between having a runtime and not having a runtime, and how those, how traditionally folks have used JavaScript to sort of smooth over those mismatches, which creates problems like this, right? Now we could use the same strategy we used with the client-side rendered JavaScript and just hide the buttons before the hydration code is available. And certainly that's an option that's available to you. But it does kind of show you the spectrum between completely client-side rendered and server-side rendered, and how progressive enhancement can really blur those lines quite a bit. So just some things to keep in mind when you're using server-rendered components, and how you might be tempted to use strategies that reduce your content layout shift, but really create components that are not usable while the JavaScript's loading. And you can take different strategies here. One specifically that comes to mind is using disabled styles until the component's hydrated, to make it more obvious to the user that the component's not ready for interaction yet, and swapping those styles when the island is ready for interaction. And you can use the new ready attribute on the island component to do that. Now, if you want to use Preact with islands, you can do that as well. I have some examples of some client-rendered Preact here. One using the auto init for Preact, and you're just feeding it in a JavaScript component from Preact. Let me show you what that looks like. JavaScript only. This example is using HTM, which is a JSX alternative. JSX will require a bundler. I didn't include an example of that just yet, but I imagine that we probably will, moving forward, have support for that with the component SSR plugin that I'm kind of hinting at in this video, that will be packaged up as a more formal plugin later. So yeah, this is what a Preact component might look like. You're rendering HTML syntax here, which is JSX-like. And you're running that and initializing that island here, so it says hello from Preact. There's another one here that has a counter on it, and here's, if we scroll down, there's some more server-side rendered hydration examples as well. Again, when it comes to server-side rendering, if you just want to render without hydration, you don't need an island. It's just HTML only. So yeah, not necessary to use the island component. But when you do include client-side JavaScript interactivity, you will want to use it with an island, so that you get more control over how and when that library and component code loads. And here's what the server-side rendered one looks like. Yeah, so we're importing the render library, we're importing the client-side JavaScript library that gets generated as part of this component Preact filter. And yeah, it renders that counter into the component container that already has the server rendered HTML inside of it. As another example, I have a lit demo page that shows some lit components getting rendered on the client. I did have a deeper integrated version in a branch on the island repo that shows how to use this with Eleventy's lit plugin. So the lit folks have put together an Eleventy plugin that does lit SSR, or SSR of web components inside of Eleventy and lit. It's linked up right on the component page here. Another one I put together was Alpine.js. And Alpine is a little bit of an edge case because Alpine is actually a little bit more, it's a little bit similar to Petite Vue, in that it operates as just a JavaScript library that you import on your page, and it is a more global library. I think it's about 14-15 kilobyte right now, but when you load the Alpine library on your page, it will actually look for any Alpine content and render that for you automatically. So when you're using Alpine and you don't want to opt into your entire page being rendered with Alpine, you can use the aforementioned template tag to sort of hide island content from Alpine until you want to initialize it. And here's an example of that. So again, when you're using the template tag, the downside here is that none of this content inside of template will be rendered without JavaScript. All right, so Svelte is perhaps, in my mind, one of the more interesting component frameworks because it requires a compiler for both client and server rendering modes. So it does require a little bit deeper server framework integration, but it also generates more optimized code. So a drawback and a benefit, I would say the drawback is just in building things that maybe you just want a quick demo of something. It's a little bit harder to get the Svelte stuff up and running in an existing project. But I think that the end product is really great because the compiler API is really great. So let me show you what that looks like in these examples. So we do have auto init for Svelte, and you can feed it just the component client-side JavaScript. And the Svelte compiler will let you just pass in a Svelte file to it, and you can get back either server-rendered markup or you can get back a client-rendered markup or both. So these first examples I'm going to go through are just client-rendered, and you can see that when you disable JavaScript here, all the client-rendered content goes away. But client-rendered Svelte is, I think, about the library is about 14 or 15 kilobyte again, so it's pretty small. And then the component code is optimized so that there is no runtime parsing happening. It should just be raw JavaScript that's running in the browser. Yeah, as opposed to some other frameworks like Alpine or Vue that require, or Petite Vue, that require that runtime parsing to happen. So yeah, that's client-side rendered Svelte. You do need a compiler for that. And the benefit is that once you have the compiler set up, it's not that much harder to get Svelte SSR working because you've already done the hard work to get the compiler in place. So yeah, here's what Svelte hydration looks like. If you don't need hydration, obviously, as I mentioned in a bunch of other demos, you don't need the island component at all because you're just rendering HTML. There's no point in mixing those. The neat thing about Svelte is that it does have CSS support built into the component structure and the component compiler itself. So if your components have CSS, which I assume that most of them will, because that's one of the major selling points of having a component, you do get CSS back from that for free. And you'll notice that this component has a blue color to the header here, the heading. That CSS is still maintained even when JavaScript is disabled. So the CSS is coming back from the server as well. And just here's some server rendered hydration examples as well. And here's what the examples for those might look like. Now, when we're using auto init, there is a slight variant of the auto init that will pass in when we want an SSR version versus a client rendered version. And that's just Svelte SSR. We pass it the HTML that we get back from the compiler and the same API in the client when we pass it in the client JavaScript bundle that gets created for this Svelte component specifically. Yeah, and so the difference between the Svelte without hydration, the Svelte without SSR and Svelte with SSR is that you need to pass in this hydrate property to the initialization constructor. Yeah, and so that's kind of it. Those are all the framework examples that I put together. You can kind of see how we're sort of marching towards a component SSR plugin for Eleventy that will bundle a lot of this together for us and under a consistent API to let us compile all of these different all of these different types of components together, which I think will unlock a lot of really cool component-driven projects that we can create moving forward. All right, so I do want to go through just a couple more quick examples before we move on. How to nest island inside of a Markdown file. So if we go back to our demo here, we have demo markdown.md, just a standard Markdown file. Because this is a web component, we can just use it inside of our Markdown, just like any other HTML. So here I have an example of using the Svelte compiler to render this myComponent.svelte component file and then put it inside of an island. And then we just auto-init it using Svelte SSR. Same as the other Svelte example I showed before. And here it is working as expected inside of this Markdown rendering in the browser. And the other thing I wanted to show just before we move on real quick is I did create a stress test file, which I thought was kind of cool to show. And this is just a page with 1,000 different islands on it. So you can scroll down to the bottom and 10,000 islands. And each one of these has a component inside of it. All right. I think that's it for this week. If y'all have any questions, definitely hit me up on Twitter and keep sharing things that you build on Twitter specifically. I love sharing those and highlighting those in these videos. So keep building, y'all. Thanks.